This meeting is the executive board meeting, executive committee meeting of the Silicon Valley Clean Energy. It is conducted in accordance with the state of California Executive Order N29-20. And if the public wishes to speak, there are instructions on the agenda that you registered for. And I think that's all I need to do. So calling the meeting to order, may we have a roll call, please?
Yes, thank you. Chair Gibbons.
Here.
Vice Chair Tyson.
Here.
Fliger.
Here.
Elahi.
Here.
Thank you. And I will note, Dr. Abe. Thank you. All are present.
Thank you. And at this point in the meeting, we have 5 items on our calendar today, beginning with approval of the minutes of the meeting of May 28th. Let's see. Do I need to call and see if anyone from the public wants to speak before we begin? I forget.
We do have a public comment period for matters not listed on our agenda today.
Okay, so shall we do that first? Do we have any members of the public wishing to speak on an item not on our agenda?
We do. Looks like Bruce Carney would like to speak.
Mr. Carney, welcome.
Thank you, Chair. And don't turn that heat up too high now. So I wanted to make a couple of comments about GHG emissions and per capita GHG emissions. 2 weeks ago, Mountain View staff released the inventory estimates for the years 2018 and 2019. The 2018 figures were final and the 2019 numbers were preliminary. The pace of decline that Silicon Valley Clean Energy hopes to achieve is on the order of 4 to 5% per year. Mountain View achieved a reduction of 0.4% between 2018 and 2019. The city will certainly meet its 2020 goals thanks to the existence of SVCE's clean energy and the fact that the pandemic reduced emissions in our city because we're such a job center city. Without people coming to the community, emissions were down notably. But one of the points I really wanted to make is that when cities or agencies set greenhouse gas emission goals that aren't based on a per capita measure, then you get very strange results when your city is either growing quickly or shrinking. Mountain View grew tremendously from 2018 to 2019 in terms of residential population. We were up by 1,000. But our daytime workforce was up by about 7,000. And so meeting a fixed GHG emissions number that was set back in 2000, a goal that was set back in the early 2000s without taking into account the rapid growth in population, I think is an error of management and an error of measurement. So the city of Mountain View is 50% bigger now in terms of its service population than it was in 2005, which is our base year. So Carbon Free Mountain View, the organization I lead, has always focused on per capita emissions. And I'd just like to ask the board members and SVCE as an agency to think really hard about whether per capita measurements are the right approach. They have one other advantage as well in that individuals who care about their personal and family emissions would express or can express their emissions on a per capita basis, but the kinds of 100,000 metric tons per annum numbers that large cities have for their emissions reports just don't mean anything on an individual basis. But 6 tons or 3 tons or 2 tons per capita has a very distinct meaning that I can compare to my own emissions. Thanks for the opportunity to speak on this.
Thank you, Bruce. That's really a marvelous comment. And since cities are doing their general plan updates, that might be of value as people think through that. So thank you for that comment. All right, we will now move on to the first of our 5 items, which is approval of the minutes of May 28th. And do we have anyone wishing to make any comments on the minutes? If not, we'll do a, accept a motion in a second. Commissioner or Director Tyson.
Hello, I was not present at the meeting, but I did read the minutes, so I think it's appropriate for me to vote on it, wouldn't you? Is
Yes,
that
yes,
correct?
you may. Procedure allows
Great.
that. So we have a motion by Director Tyson and a second by
Second, Abikoga.
Abby Koga. Thank you very much. May we have a roll call, please?
Yes, thank you. Chair Gibbons,
Aye.
Vice Chair Tyson,
Yes.
Fliger,
Yes.
thank you. Elahi,
Yes.
Abikoga,
Aye.
thank you. That motion carries unanimously.
Thank you. And now we have our always informative CEO update. And I was just going to remind everyone that one of the real advantages of being on the executive committee is an opportunity to give feedback to staff to really help them understand what the board might want to understand, think how information might be presented. So as we go through the various topics, please feel free to make suggestions that you think would be beneficial for a successful board meeting. And Girish, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Gibbons. I have several items I'd like to update you on. Maybe I'll start with some very good news. Andrea is going to be out on family leave starting in August. She's expecting her baby daughter, and we're all very excited to see a new addition to the SVCE family. And so we are also arranging for backup resources. So we'll introduce you to the folks who will be her backup for several months once we put those resources in place.
One of the advantages and disadvantages of Zoom meetings.
Yes, exactly. Another item is last week, President Biden signed into law Juneteenth as a federal holiday. We will be changing our policies, obviously, to include that. We'll also reach out to cities to see what you're doing in terms of maybe some recognition of Juneteenth even before 2022. Also in June, a week ago, you had Flex alerts, and Pamela reached out to all of you. Thank you all for utilizing social media to get the word out. We also had extremely high prices for a few days. And so that'll probably lead to some increased costs for our June actuals. So numbers come to us a little later, though we are 100% hedged. That's on expected load versus actuals. So we'll be getting those actuals in, and then we'll update the Risk Oversight Committee on that. After I finish speaking, I'll turn it over to Melissa, who will talk about just a plethora of regulatory decisions, momentous decisions that have come down that are really going to impact SVCE for the next few years. And that's also kind of, some of this is going to factor into our budget discussions too. We'll also be looking at board meetings. We'll be updating you in August about how we manage board meetings in person after September. At this point, we are planning on all virtual through September 30th, which is when the governor's executive order deadline goes to. And then we'll be looking at hybrid opportunities, right? So we'll be coming back to you with some ideas in the August exec meeting, and then we'll also bring it back to the board. Last meeting, I talked to you about SB 1383, which is a compliance requirement that all cities have on organic waste. There's an opportunity for, we had talked to you about SVCE helping with putting an RFP out where you can buy green power that is fueled by renewable natural gas. I've talked to staffers at the cities who are involved in this and asked to postpone our involvement by at least 6 months. This is due to staffing constraints at SVCE, where the staff that would be needed to move this forward are in a group that's the most impacted in terms of lack of staffing, and that's our power supply group. So I can't spare the staff. Fortunately, staff from the cities have said that's going to be perfectly fine, and moving it 6 months is not going to be an issue. Earlier this morning, the CCC FA, which stands for California Community Choice Financing Authority, which is the Joint Powers Agency financing authority that would allow us to enter into prepay transactions. So this would be the financing authority that actually issues the bonds. This agency's first meeting was held today. So it was essentially the formation meeting. The next meeting of that agency, I expect, would be when we actually have a transaction, which there's a lot of work that is being undertaken as we speak to move that forward, and that could come up very quickly. Lastly, I'll talk the WCE bankruptcy, Western Community Energy. I'd updated you previously that they had declared Chapter 9 bankruptcy. Subsequent to that, working with Southern California Edison and the California Public Utilities Commission, WCE went through the process of decertification as a CCA. All their customers were returned to Edison, and the previous concern they had of returning customers being exposed to current market prices was resolved, and those customers are being returned to Edison, and they will be paying Edison's bundled rate. So the customers are essentially going to be neutral. Rating agencies have reached out to several CCAs, including ourselves. We have had one discussion with one of the rating agencies already. We have a second discussion scheduled with the second rating agency next week. And we'll also be getting a more detailed review of SVCE in the July-August timeframe. The reason I'm bringing it up, not just to inform you, but also it's giving a little background as we get into the budget discussion later in this meeting about the importance of having very strong reserves. With that, I'm now going to turn it over to Melissa to give you an update, at least the headlines, on several regulatory proceedings where decisions have been made. Melissa?
Thank you, Girish. So yesterday, the CPUC had their voting meeting, and as Girish said, there were a number of decisions that were very impactful to SVCE and CCAs more broadly. I'm going to highlight the three biggest ones. And so the first one is that the CPUC voted for an additional 11.5 gigawatts of energy to be procured through the midterm, and that's between 2023 to 2026. Of that, SVCE's portion is 237 megawatts. There are a number of rules with regards to this decision, but I just want to let you guys know that this decision was adopted yesterday. The commissioners, I was listening to the commission meeting, the commissioners did acknowledge this is an unprecedented amount of procurement, incremental procurement. And again, it's to meet the reliability needs during this midterm period. The next decision was related to COVID-19 debt. The PUC adopted a decision that allowed for payment plans for both residential and small commercial customers who have accumulated bill debt in the COVID-19 period. The key takeaway from this one is the decision actually was modified to extend the moratorium, the disconnection moratorium, which was supposed to end at the end of this month, at the end of June, to the end of September, so September 30th. And Again, in the meeting, there were a number, during the public comment section, there were a number of advocates and customers who spoke to this issue and requested an extension of this disconnection moratorium. And then the last one, I just wanted to end on a positive note, is that the direct access decision, which recommended against expansion of direct access, was voted out by the commission. And so the commission determined that expansion shouldn't happen due to reliability issues, right, that we're all dealing with right now. And also they could not conclude that the state could meet its greenhouse gas goals if they were to expand direct access at this time. So those were that's the highlight, the high level snapshot. I will stop there and see if you have any questions.
I do not see any, but I appreciate the reference to the debt the disconnection date. I assume that that means that our policy will also change.
Yes, we will update that too, and it will have impact on our reserve. Yeah, we will update that.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Melissa.
And
Okay,
I have no other update, Chair Gibbons.
thank you. And if there's no more questions for our CEO, we will move on to the regular calendar item number 3, which is the equity framework discussion. And I think that is with Amy and Melissa, I believe.
Yeah, so if we can just pull up the slides, which are coming up right now. So yes, we're going to talk about the equity framework. Specifically, I will begin the presentation and talk about our overall approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I'm going to pass it over to Amy, who's going to talk about one piece of it related to the program side and equity. Next slide. So as you all know, equity is one of the 5 strategic focuses in our strategic plan. And so we've been thinking about the idea of equity and thinking about it, how to address it holistically. So we are developing a vision for addressing this across our organization, both in terms of our internal processes and our external offerings. And so the purpose of the strategy is to provide opportunities, increase access, and promote fairness across all of SVCE's activities. And so there are what we call 3 pillars to this right now. This is our approach. There's the programs, which is external facing, and that's integrating equity into SVCE's program offerings. And Amy's going to go into detail in this presentation today. And then there are 2 other pillars. There's supplier diversity, which is contracting and partnering with diverse businesses. As you know, we are subject to supplier diversity reporting requirements per statute that go to the PUC. And as we're doing that, we are developing our supplier diversity process just to establish best practices to increase our diverse supplier contracting efforts. And then on the internal side, there's staffing or workforce development, and that is recruiting, attracting, and retaining a diverse workforce. And I know there's been a number of discussions in previous board meetings and extensive discussions about building and retaining our workforce. So this is a critical piece of it there. So as I said, Amy's going to talk about programs and their approach to that. The supply diversity and staffing pieces are in development. The plan, I was planning to present in the executive committee in July, forgetting that July, there was no executive committee meeting, but we will be reporting and talking about supply diversity and staffing in the meetings later this summer. And I'll stop there before I turn it over to Amy to see if there are any questions about just the overarching framework. Okay.
Everyone on my screen all at the same time, so I don't see any hands up.
Okay, well.
Nisa?
So thanks for that, Melissa. And I'm just trying to, and this is wonderful. Is this a new program we're launching? Are we building on things we have had in place in the past? Can you talk to what we've done in the past and where this is taking us?
That's a good question. I think it's building, it's both. I feel like it is both. It's building upon what we've done in the past. I can't speak too much to what we've done being relatively new, but I mean, just speaking on supplier diversity, we issued a report in February that's building upon the past, but I think now it's about really being thoughtful in terms of how we attract and recruit diverse suppliers. In terms of staffing, we've been thinking about recruiting, retaining staffing for probably forever, but it's been a big priority now in the time of COVID. And again, it's building upon that and really thinking through how do we make sure that we're being truly inclusive in terms of building and retaining our workforce. And I would say the same thing is it's the same in programs. I know there's been a lot of work and data collection on the program side, which Amy can speak much better to. And again, it's just moving forward and building upon that as well. So I do think it is building upon existing work, but really expanding from there.
And do we have legal working with us, especially on the supplier diversity piece? Because I know there's, do we have
an attorney?
Right, so do we have legal support for the supplier diversity piece? I would recommend, Girish, if this wasn't part of the review plan, to definitely have an attorney review that piece.
That's a great point. We don't have legal at this point, even though there are certain legal limitations that we have. So we will definitely make sure we prioritize that. Thank you for that suggestion.
And then just one last question, Liz. Still on the supplier diversity piece, I mean, it's a very unique industry. And I'm just curious, even anecdotally, if we know how diverse our supplier partners really are as we develop this policy.
We don't have, I don't have numbers at this point, but this is something we're looking into, especially in terms of contracting. So much of the vast majority of our contracting is on power supply. So it's looking there, and we are collecting data in terms of any RFOs that we do there. We're collecting data on the non-power supply side in terms of that. So we are collecting data, but we don't have like a full comprehensive visibility at this time in terms of how diverse we are. One thing we are looking at though is, we have the pool that we usually go to, but in terms of supplier diversity, one thing we're exploring is also what other ways when we do contracting can we, where can we advertise to basically recruit more diverse contractors. But I think your point is well taken in terms of like, how large is this pool?
I look forward to the report, I guess, in August, since we're not meeting in July. Thank you.
Thank you. And Director Alahi.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you're starting this program because it's going to take a little bit of time to build up, especially the suppliers that we use are usually very large suppliers. And I mean, that needs to be encouraged, and probably more support needs to be given so you can get diversity suppliers in the picture, because I suspect these are huge corporations that can do those massive projects. But since we are the ones who are we can almost get them started with a contract with us, they can go to a bank and have a better shot. So I'm glad you guys are doing it. The staffing also, given the difficulty that we already have staffing, a lot of effort has going to have to be undertaken to make sure we can get a diverse staff. It may actually provide us opportunities with filling some of the slots if you're more aggressive about it. But I'm glad you're starting it. I mean, this is going to be a great program. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see no other hands up. And thanks, Militia. And we'll go to Amy. Nice to see you, Amy.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Building on Melicia's comments, I'll share a bit more about what we're doing specifically on the program side with the development of the equity framework on that side of the shop. So just as a reminder, this was an initiative that was included in the current strategic plan approved by the board. And the overarching goal really for this program's framework is shown here. So this is the scope of what we're trying to achieve, just really establishing a set of guidelines and procedures to integrate equity considerations and priorities into SVCE's program efforts. And it's intended to be a systematic framework that will really help enable SVCE to better engage with and serve all of our customers, including those who face the biggest barriers to participating in the decarbonization transition. And related to Director Sligor's question about, is this new or is this building on past work? I did want to provide just a couple comments on that. This is a new framework that we're developing on the program side, but it is, as Mel said, very much building on past work. Equity has been a really key part of our program's portfolio from the start. In the decarb strategy and programs roadmap, equity is one of the 5 prioritization criterias that that was adopted as a part of that roadmap, and that staff use for evaluating any and every program opportunity. And so we really have incorporated equity considerations in every single program we've launched to date. And we also have a lot of programs that really focus specifically on underserved customers, such as customers who are renters, in MUD properties, needing reliable charging access, et cetera. However, this program's equity framework will help us really codify and build on what we're doing and improve what we're doing in a very systematic way. Next slide, please. So as Mel described, we'll develop this framework in parallel with the broader vision for diversity, equity, and inclusion. To make this a bit more concrete, for the program's equity framework in particular, we expect the final product here to be a pretty concise policy that will come forward to the board, probably less than 5 pages, and cover these 4 elements, specifically a mission statement. We'd include equity indicators that we'd be prioritizing and leveraging, and an approach statement, as well as methodology. And on the next slide, we dive into this a little bit more deeply. So for the mission statement, this will be maybe a 2 to 5 sentence statement that really gets at the heart of it, which is what is our definition of success for building a more equitable programs portfolio. And this in particular is going to be the result of a lot of stakeholder engagement starting now. The primary and secondary equity indicators are specifically establishing our designations for underserved communities. How are we going to characterize equity? The third part is the approach statement, really helping to kind of crystallize and identify our values and priorities that will structure our approach to bringing greater equity into our programs. And then probably the majority of this policy doc will be kind of codifying the methodologies, the procedures and the processes that we're going to operationalize to ensure we're taking a systematic approach to incorporating equity. Okay, next slide, please. So on the second item, the equity indicators definition, we actually aren't starting from scratch on this. We did have a talented and very passionate intern, Freya Che, last year, who carried out a great deal of background research and synthesis, as well as analysis on this topic, specifically what are various indicators at the household level, at the community level, that SVCE could leverage. And the result of that analysis was that this indicator in particular, SEVI, the Socioeconomic Vulnerability Index, was the kind of best one to characterize our particular communities. And so from that analysis, we have been leveraging SEVI. If you recall from the customer engagement surveys that we've been carrying out, that were presented to the executive committee and the board earlier this year. And in a variety of different ways we've been using SEVI. It really gets at specifically helping to identify communities least able to afford increases in essential services. And it's kind of a composite indicator that takes into account poverty, unemployment, education, linguistic isolation, as well as housing cost burden. And so we found this to be a very effective one at characterizing our customer base, but we definitely do not need to restrict ourselves to a single indicator. There are a variety of other indicators that we can additionally use to really supplement our characterizations of equity across our communities and customer base. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the general timeline for developing the programs framework. And we're at the fairly early stages here. We covered this item in our MOG earlier this week to get their initial feedback. They were extremely supportive of both the broader diversity, equity, and inclusion framework that's being pursued, as well as the proposed components of the programs framework. They also were able to share some equity-focused initiatives in development across the member agencies where there might be some potential for coordination, and also highlighted some examples from other cities that we can learn from. And so, apologies for my dog barking. So we're in the early stages here. We'd love to, I'd love to stop my comments and then hear from the executive committee and the public. We'd welcome any initial reactions or suggestions to really help make sure that we're starting out on the right foot. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Amy. I would just offer, since we do have on the board several new members, if you could send out prior to the board meeting or include in it the link to the SEVI presentation. It was very helpful and quite informative. So I think everyone would benefit from having access to that. Questions? I see no hands raised. Okay, all looks good to us. Okay, thank you very much, Melissa and Amy. And with that, we will move on to item number 4, which is the strategic plan debrief and next steps.
Thank you, Chair Gibbons. And Andrea's going to pull up these slides, and as she goes to slide number 2. So this is, we captured all the feedback that you provided us and attempting to summarize it over here. So to remind all of us, we've had 2 meetings so far. We had come to the executive committee on May 28th with the strategic plan update, and then of course to the board, where we got quite a bit of input. And so we are here for the 3rd time. So can we go to the next slide? Big picture, there was no change to the mission. There's essentially agreement on the 5 focus areas, and there was significant feedback about one of those focus areas. It was significantly more than feedback for any of the other focus areas. So we'll spend some time on that today. And then there was some additional input on existing goals and the work plan that is more detailed. So if we go to the next slide, this is FYI, this is the mission and the measure of the mission. So this would be kept the same. The next slide. So there were some general comments that we captured that really didn't fit into any one strategic focus areas. Just mention a few. For example, the second bullet here, the second line here is the CEO's goals are linked and should be linked to the 5 focus areas. There was overall just positive input about it's a balancing act among these 5 focus areas in our strategic plan. We're glad that we are discussing this as a board and staff that we are looking at the horizon and bring this to discussion in a timely manner. Also that we are ambitious. We are aligned as kind of a moment in time where we are aligned with the federal government, and we may want to increase capacity to take advantage of opportunities. I think that's also an important one given the next topic you're going to hear about, which is the budget, because all these plans and visions, at the end of the day, we want to translate into how can we get things done, and the budget would be the controlling document for that. Also, there were comments on there are areas in the work plan that benefit cities and customers specifically, and we need to highlight that. And also, maybe we should look at how we allocate community funding that may be more proportional to disadvantaged communities versus maybe based on size. Next slide. So these are the 5 focus areas on the right-hand side. I'll kind of go through them one by one, but essentially spending time on staffing. So next slide. On staffing, there was a lot of input. We have taken detailed notes of that, and we'll be mirroring that back to you and actually acting on a lot of that, both at the budget presentation that will follow this and at the August 2nd Finance Committee meeting and the August 8th board meeting. So you'll be seeing a lot of that coming to you. But in general, staffing, we kind of summarized into 4 broad categories of input. One was, let's match workload to staffing. So we need to balance staffing as not just increasing staffing, but also fine-tuning our workload. So there may be things that we're just going to postpone. Like, for example, I mentioned to you earlier today, the SB 1383 work, we're just postponing for 6 months. So we're going to work internally with all the departments and come back to you in the August timeframe to say, here are some things that we will be pushing out. Another is building capacity and policies to recruit and retain. And so that would be capacity to hire. So whether that's HR capacity, recruiting capacity, and also policies to attract people and policies for retaining people, whether it's longevity benefits and things like that. Ideas that were also proposed were overhiring. And when I heard the numbers that were provided by Chair Gibbons about just Campbell, it seemed like there was a 15% overhiring for key positions. It wasn't across the enterprise, but it looked like it was the uniformed staff. There was a 15% overhiring. So it was not the entire police department. So that's what I got out of it. It may be some key functions that we'll focus on overhiring. And that's essentially a physical hedge for us. Also look at long-term staffing. Where do we want to be 3 and 5 years from now? And also learn from reasons for turnover. I believe that was several board members mentioned that. And then there was also several comments on additional flexibility for the CEO for hiring and retention. And we've teed up some of that at the next presentation, the budget presentation. I've also reached out to other CCAs about what they do. And I've got some ideas that I think would be a good balance of oversight and some delegation of authority. So those were essentially what we were looking at on staffing. Next slide. The next area that had the most amount of input was on financial stability and trade-offs. And most of these comments were what I would say were really strategic in terms of there really wasn't too much about today, so it was additional value. What distinguishes us from PG&E? And if you look at bullets 3 and 4, it's like looking at carbon free. It seemed like overall it was like, yep, we should be carbon free, but the discount to PG&E, maybe we can be flexible on that. It was also there was comments about where do we want to be as an organization 5 to 10 years from now, and that would help us with these trade-offs. And lastly, it was using reserves in a balanced manner to balance out discount versus carbon free. Next slide. The remaining 3 focus areas, there really wasn't any real specific comments other than a thumbs up saying, yep, good. And this comes both from the May 28th Executive Committee meeting and the June 9th board meeting. There just seemed to be, yep, that makes sense. And there was some comments. The exec committee actually promoted cyber risk management to be one, part of a focus area. So you already made that change. And there were 1 or 2 comments at the board meeting about, yep, that makes sense. We need to do. Next slide. There was also other comments that were made by the board and the executive committee that I've combined here, which is continue the focus on equity. So it gets to board member Fligger's comment about, is equity a new issue? We actually teed it up last year as one of the 5 focus areas. And we are looking at these focus areas of things that are important that require our attention. So there are a number of things in our strategic plan that are in flight, but we have 20 goals on our strategic plan and 62 measures. There's just too much to talk to the board about when you have that many. So these focus areas are a way of talking about, for this coming year, what is it that we should really be highlighting? And then once it becomes in flight, it'll continue to be worked on. For example, equity is now going to be part of our policies and will be worked on, but they're not going to be called out as one of the 5 focus areas because it's been embedded into board policy already. So we will continue to focus on equity, and that was a comment that we got at the board meeting. Enhancing, this was the next bullet came from the executive committee, which is enhance the work plan to focus on transportation opportunities, including getting funding and regional collaboration. And then staff had proposed adding resilience to a strategic plan goal, and the exec committee was okay with that. So this is a summary of what we've heard at the exec committee and at the June 9th board meeting. And if you could go to the last slide of the presentation. So you've seen the timeline on the top, which is there's a combination of the CEO evaluation and you discussing where we want to go strategically, kind of working on this together. We will be bringing the budget for review at the finance committee. And based on your comments for this item and at the budget item, which is the next one, the finance committee will be seeing things on the budget, which will be influenced by your input. We'll then bring it to the August 11th board meeting. And at that board meeting, I'd like to spend about 20 minutes going over FY21 accomplishments. I'd like to have each of the directors talk to you for about 4 minutes or so on what we've accomplished as an agency. Then, of course, we'll go through the budget review and the detailed strategic plan. I'm not going to go over it with you in a presentation because that's 8 pages of single-spaced, but that will be part of the staff report of the 20 goals that we have that will incorporate all the input that we've got so far. If you, based on your input there, we'll then go to the September 8th board meeting where we'll present the budget and the strategic plan for adoption. The remaining slides are just backup slides, which I'm not going to go through, but I'll end my presentation here and take your questions and comments. You're muted, Chair.
I'm trying to keep myself quiet. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we will have director's comments and then go to the public for comments. And Director Fligor, to begin with you, please.
Thank you, Chair. On the additional staffing slide, Girish, I think it was, if you could pull that up again, number 4. where it talked about learn from reasons for the turnover. I thought in addition to that, one of the direction from the board was also to do a deep dive. And I know either I said it or I supported it, to try to identify not just, and it's implied, but I do think it should be more explicit that we're going to try to identify the reasons why we have experienced this turnover and then learn from it.
Okay, I will. So I'll change that point to a deep dive. So we will be doing that. Yeah.
And then the second thing, as I was looking at the other three focus areas, and I agree with you, we didn't spend a lot of time at the board meeting talking about it, but I saw procurement, that clean energy mix focus area. And I thought of what we're going through right now with our drought season, and whether or not that's going to impact any of our, hydroelectric supply or, increased demand, how will that impact our plans and the contracts we have in place? So if you could address that.
Yeah, so this is also connected. It's not just short term. So hydro changes could change year to year. This year, it's not just us, but the Pacific Northwest also has less hydro. So the prices for carbon-free energy have actually been increasing. It's almost doubled from our estimate from last year. It's what Melissa teed up in the regulatory update. The 11,500 megawatts of clean energy procurement in the next 4 years that's another shift. So there's a lot of instructions that we have received from the CPUC about how we need to procure and when we need to procure and what we need to procure. And as early as recently as this morning, Monica was in a meeting with 9 other CCAs talking about opportunities to collaborate for joint procurement. So that's going to be a big piece, not just the new procurement we're going to have to make of close to 250 megawatts of clean energy, but that last bullet on internal operations, that is a big piece because our first PPA of the 13 PPAs we've signed is going to come online this December. And there's a lot of work that's going to take place between us and 3CE to actually integrate those physical assets into our portfolio. We've never had to do that before. So in fact, we're bringing in some external resources to help us with that. So hydro will impact us, and that's part of the volatility of pricing. So there's two things. There's availability. We want to make sure we are hedged from a price standpoint. We also want to make sure that we are 100% carbon free. And then, of course, from a risk standpoint, we want to maintain very strong reserves because we cannot predict market prices or our load perfectly.
Thanks, Girish. Was it 3CE that filed for bankruptcy?
No.
Good.
3CE is our partner, WCE. The thing you find, a lot of our CCAs have community energy in their acronym. So the CEs tend to be there.
Thank you. I see no other hands from the board at this point, so we will go to the public. And I see a hand raised by Mr. Bruce Carney.
Thank you again for the opportunity to share some thoughts. I remember a slide from a strategy discussion maybe 2 or 3 years ago that listed a wide variety of groups with whom SVCE might collaborate. For example, one group was companies and individuals who installed heat pump hot water heaters. And another group of particular interest to me was universities. So I get emails from Stanford and from Cal about research that they're doing about programs that are being developed or inventions that are being developed within their engineering departments. And many of these things are extremely exciting. And I think it could benefit both the universities and SVC and its customers if there was greater collaboration between those two universities in particular and SVCE. You know, the professors and researchers at these world-class universities have sway worldwide, but sometimes when I hear them talk, it feels to me like they're a little bit disconnected from the realities of being an organization like SVCE. For example, and not just to pick on him, but Mark Jacobson from Stanford, a longtime advocate of solar thermal, where you use mirrors to heat up molten salt and that provides electricity into the evening, hasn't seemed to shift his opinion about that technology's benefits in the 4 or 5 years that I've heard him speak. But that technology is not one that I believe has ever been considered by SVCE, and probably for good reason. It's not 100% carbon free, and it's very expensive compared to solar PV plus batteries. But at some point, there should be a way for SVCE and these research universities to really gain from a tighter collaboration than they've had up to now. And so I hope that will be part of the strategy going forward.
Thank you, Bruce. And we're bringing the discussion back to the executive committee. I'll offer a couple of thoughts. I do remember the collaborative group discussion mentioned by Bruce, so it might be worth going back and taking a look at that. I also thought in the staffing, when we first started, it is fair to say that we knew staffing was going to be a challenge, one, because we weren't quite sure what we needed when, but we were a new company, a new organization, who would come to join us. Then there was the question of people really wanting to do something, join something that was new and exciting. And then there was the concern about poaching as the other new CCAs came on board, because we knew we were one of the early ones in our neck of the woods, at least. And now the staffing has changed. The issues with staffing has changed. The CCAs are not the only game in town. Now there's a lot of new innovative ideas, and not unlike what Bruce was just referencing, and I think what other earlier comments are about. So our business is fundamentally changing with the PPAs coming online, and the whole staffing, who's the right people, how to reach out, how to retain, and what's the competition. So there's two changes. One is what our business activities and staffing needs are, and two is the marketplace and competition. I think it's important, perhaps even for the newer members, that realize these are really, I'm going to say, seismic changes. They are really monumental changes to how our organization is going to be moving forward. So I think putting the points forward as a strategic plan comment or focus is really, really important for us. I like the idea of doing the achievements, what's been accomplished. I think sometimes it's easy to overlook what we've actually done. And I also think it's helpful for board members to have a clear picture of what's been done so that they can speak publicly on that. And let's see, what are my other notes? And the other one is, I know staff has got some, I think, some very appropriate and exciting ideas on how to support cities, how to help cities with permitting and different support for reach codes and other things. And I think moving forward with that next level of engagement with our cities is also extremely important. So I thought the presentation was good. I would say in terms of going to the board, I would look to make sure that we give some examples. And it's always helpful. And I had one other note here which says, on working with the cities, we might do things called, which we all talk about as best practices. And we may want to have some kind of an ad hoc committee talking about best practices that Silicon Valley Clean Energy can do to help the member cities. So those were some of my notes. Anyone else? Anyone else have something they would like to suggest that the staff incorporate into their presentation? And Director Tyson, I saw your hand go up.
Thank you. Yes, I like your comments, and I don't have that much to add to them. I did have the same impression. I thought the presentations we saw, and I'm just going to say overall, were very were good and clear, but there were times where I was kind of wondering where's the oomph there. So when Chair Gibbons said provide an example of something, that really works for me to kind of engage to say, and here's an example of what we're doing. I think we're all focused on a little bit of the employee satisfaction and retention, and it's a moving target. We're all coming out of COVID. We're receptive and I think alert to what others are doing in terms of the changing workplace. I'm sure many cities are finding they have open positions, and they're figuring out how to fill them and how all that works too. I'm kind of curious to say, who is our pool of potential employees, and is our competition other CCAs, or are we trying to pry people out of PG&E and other utilities, and that would be just something as we look at our acquiring or attracting people and then retaining them, just who are we competing against?
Thank you. And Director Abikoga.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation and the comments. Yesterday I participated in the Air District's Mobile Source Committee that I'm on, and we had a number of presentations on transportation and EVs, and I guess I learned the goal of 1.5 million EVs by 2030 in the Bay Area. And, clear, of course, there's a synergy here, and we've talked about, working more collaboratively with other agencies. And I guess it just got me thinking about, I know we have a lot of challenges going on, but I guess I'm always trying to think about the programs and the programs we have. When can we add more programs? How do we collaborate with these other agencies to reach these goals that have been set out there? So in light of all of the challenges we're dealing with, our budget, I guess I was hoping for a little more clarity on what the path is to get to these goals, in light of as I mentioned, the challenges, our budgetary challenges right now. So if there could be some more information in that regard, I would really appreciate that. Because I think we've done a lot. I think we've done a lot, definitely. But I guess I felt yesterday, it's like, oh wow, we have a long ways to go. So that would be great if we could get more, like the program piece, I guess, could be included in this overall picture. Thank you.
Thank you. Girish?
Yeah, so I'll address two questions. One is from Board Member Tyson. Who are we competing against for employees? It's kind of all of the above, you did say. But the other thing is, with all the money that's coming down on clean energy, various companies are hiring. So whether these are fossil fuel based companies that are really expanding into the clean energy sector, it's large corporations that want to be buying more renewable energy. This is again across the country. They'll be looking at some of these towns, and then of course the CCAs and IOUs. So you provided me the authority to hire a recruiter that specializes in the energy sector. And so I just signed a contract with this person this week for 3 positions, all on the power supply side. We are also going to be reaching out to another recruiter on a contingency basis to look at some other open positions. Moving on to the other question from Board Member Abikoga. Yes on programs and collaboration. Yes on all of that. Today's presentation is essentially focused on mirroring what you've said. So I wanted to keep it kind of high level, but at the same time, I think what I'm hearing from you, and we'll talk about this in the budget, where you can give us more direction, and we'll take this. This year's budget, we had some challenges in the sense that we were dipping into reserves up to 6 million. The good news is the margin forecast for next year looks very, very positive. So the question for you is going to be, where do you want to target this forecasted additional revenues? And I'll just say that the first thing that I would prioritize is reserves. Make the reserves even stronger than what they are. Given the bankruptcy that we've had with one of the CCAs, we fully expect to have legislation being brought in to regulate CCAs even more. And there may be some minimum requirements on financials. So I think putting aside a bunch of money for reserves would be one. I think we'll balance something with an additional rate discount. But I think programs would be another area. You could basically say, hey, you can double the program budget from $5 million to $10 million. For the coming year, we may have to hire contract staff to actually make sure the money goes out. But that's kind of what I'm hearing from you. And we'll talk about it at the next item too. So Chair Gibbons, I think what I'm hearing overall is, yep, we've mirrored pretty satisfactorily. I've got Board Member Flygore's comment about actually making it's double click on the deep dive aspect. We'll do that. And
give some examples. Oh, Girish, frozen. There you go.
Far the direction gave us in June, the board's given some pretty clear direction. So with this meeting to kind of make sure that we've captured board direction, I'm looking at this as you've given us direction already. So at this point, there's not much more in terms of formulating a strategy. It's like, here's what you've told us, here's what it's going to look like in the budget. So for the August meeting, it's essentially going to be very high level. I would think it's just going to be 2 or 3 slides. My attachment will actually have the detailed work plan associated with it that you'll be adopting, the 20 goals, etc. And the budget is where I think the action is going to be, right? Because whatever direction you've given us on June 9th and today, it's going to translate into an increase in staffing dollars. And we haven't estimated that yet, but I'm expecting that to be at least a 10% on our non-operating costs are going to go up by at least a couple of $1 million. So you'll see that at the August 2nd Finance Committee meeting. If you give us further direction on, say, programs, you want to see more money on programs, options, you'll see that too. So I think August is going to be more implementation and options of your direction. That's the way I'm seeing it. And so I'd love to hear from you if you're seeing it that way too.
I think that's helpful to understand, and the material you put together expressing that your recent summary makes sense. I think that will help the board focus. I would encourage using examples where you can, again, that we're looking to what will help the board come along with what you're suggesting. I think that would be helpful. So I didn't hear anything else other than your summary then. If there's no other comments, we will then move on to item number 5, which is going to be a humdinger. I have absolutely no doubt about it. And Amrit, I think you are going to cover our 2020 budget kickoff.
That's right. Good afternoon, directors. So I'll start with a preview of the budget. As Grish mentioned, we'll come back with more detailed numbers in August, starting with the Finance Committee. So Andrea, if we can go to the next slide. Grish kind of covered this timeline a bit. We started with the strategic plan overview. Today we're previewing high level at the budget. At the August 2nd Finance Committee meeting, we will come with the first set of numbers as to how the numbers are looking. Then we'll present the budget to the board, a draft of it, and then in August we will work to incorporate the comments and feedback we get from the board. And then September 8th is when we will present the budget for adoption. And then in March or around March timeframe is when we will do the mid-year review and adjustment of the budget. So that's kind of our timeline, and it's consistent with past years. So go to the next slide, please. So Grish kind of already alluded to this, and nothing like starting the presentation with some very good news. We are looking at substantially improved margins for next year. And this is driven by the two big drivers that affect us as an organization, our competitive positioning relative to PG&E, and that's driven by PG&E, the rate PG&E charges, the generation rate they charge the bundle customers, and the PCIA that they charge our customers. So what's happening, and the numbers I'm projecting are based on PG&E's 2022 ERA forecast application. So in June, PG&E makes a forecast application for their energy resources recovery account. And then around September, November timeframe, they update that projection. And then the commission adopts that at the last meeting in December as part of PG&E's AET annual electric true-up filing. And then the rates go in effect in January. So the preliminary forecast that PG&E put out is that the generation rate would be about 11.8 cents a kilowatt hour, and PCIA will go to 2.7 cents. And right now the gen rate is about 10.96, and PCIA is about 4.6 cents. So that's about a 7.5% increase in gen rate and about a 40% or 41% decrease in the PCIA rate. Again, this is a forecast, so we won't know the actual until the PUC decision in late December. But if these rates prevail, we're looking at our margins improving by about 43%. And one thing I will add is that we work with a few consultants to also monitor PG&E rates, PCIA and PG&E generation rates, and also the Cal CCA consultant, NewGen. And before even PG&E came out with these numbers, that model was also predicting 11.8 cents and PCIA at 2.4, slightly lower. So we were pleased to see that the numbers were aligned. And that is a model that we're incorporating in our planning processes so that we can actively, on a week-to-week basis, monitor fluctuations in PCIA and generate on a forecasted basis to the best of our ability. Of course, we don't have deep insights into PG&E's portfolio, but through publicly available information that these consultants use to derive these forecasts. And that will, we use that not only to see what our headroom variability is, but also as a portfolio risk measure. So that's an improvement we're making in our modeling. We'll be tracking this going forward as to how these numbers, we think on a forecast basis, will move. And mainly the variability we're capturing is is power prices, the impact of power prices on PGE's generation rate and on the PCIA. So coming back to these set of numbers, we are recommending to keep the discount rate at 1%, not to change that until we know what PG&E's rates are. And when PG&E's rates are, we can come back to the board in a January timeframe and say, what do we want to do? You know, like Grish said, do we want to now change the discount rate? Do you want to put more money into the programs fund? And also, you can give that feedback to us right now as well, whether we should be anticipating some of that in how we basically derive our budget numbers. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. So coming to our budget, as you know, the big driver of our budget is power supply expenses. And these are numbers based on the mid-year budget. You can see that more than 90% of the cost is from the power supply portfolio. And our overhead cost relative to overall budget is very low. At mid-year, we were expecting power supply expenses to be about $235 million for the current fiscal year. But one thing I want to mention is that these costs are very volatile. Right? They're subject to whatever the market is, and we can easily exceed or come under the budget due to fluctuations in power prices, due to fluctuations in demand for energy. If we have heat wave and our customers' demand goes up, at the same time prices goes up, we can easily exceed this budget, and there's not much we can do. There's things we can do on a proactive basis, which is what we do, and I'll cover that in the next set of slides, and that's hedging. And all the controls we have on our procurement portfolio. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. Okay, so looking at this is our preliminary estimate of power supply expenses. We're looking at next fiscal year to be about close to $260 million versus 235, which is our current expectation. We're expecting load to stay stable. We'll do some sensitivities to see if we have a higher level of recovery from COVID. Going into the budget for next fiscal year, we're 76% on an expected basis hedged. In other words, 76% on expected basis, we know what the cost of that portfolio will be. 24% is still exposed to market, and by the end of September, before the next fiscal year starts, our plan is to be 100% hedged on an expected basis. As Grish mentioned, you know, the environmental attribute products, carbon-free and renewable attribute products, the costs are higher now because of the hydro conditions. Some new element to our portfolio that we've talked about is the PPAs, the power purchase agreements that we have signed will start coming online, started with the end of this year, and then trickling in a few of the contracts will trickle through in 2022. And these are at much lower cost than current market costs. And so that will help that's actually bringing our costs down. And then the challenge we have with resource adequacy in a capacity tight market, that's also driving up our power costs. And the last cost element here is the CAISO. This is basically CAISO's administrative costs and costs of running the grid. We expect that to remain on an expected basis to remain stable. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a repeat of the previous slide. It shows you the breakdown of our costs. In the gray is our current open position. Then the contracted supply, our current hedges that we have in place. The green is the PPAs that are coming online. And the baby blue, I'll call it, the environmental products. That is one box that has shrunk from previous year, while all the other ones have costs are higher. And that's again because of the PPAs that are coming online are lower costs, and we don't have to go out and buy expensive RECs because these are all PCC1 products. And then we have the resource adequacy and the CAISO costs. Okay, I'll move to the next slide. So we'll talk about the way we manage our power procurement portfolio and the kind of oversight that the board has in managing the procurement portfolio. The key big driver is our energy risk management, board-approved energy risk management policy that lays out, and the table here shows our targets as to how we want to be layering in our hedges over a 5-year period of time. You can see for calendar year 22, our target is to be 70 and 90%. Currently, we're at 70%. Our target is to get to 100%. And on the right, we're showing you our current position, which is 76% hedge. That's with, in the orange box, the 1.2 terawatt hour. That's our IST, the physical hedges we have with the with providers, and then the green is our PPAs coming online, providing the additional 9 terawatt hours of hedge, and remaining is that 24%. That's the open position. So this is one of the key documents and key policies that are put in place to basically take control of to manage what we can manage using industry best practices, our portfolio. But beyond that, of course, we're always subject to the whims of the market as to how. And remember, when we hedge, it's not, when we say we're 76% hedge, we're not every hour, we're not matched load to resource, right? Because our load is shaped load, this variability each and every hour. A lot of these hedges are block hedges, whether they're the same quantity. So some hours we may be long on an expected basis, some hours we may be short, and the hours, prices in the hours tend to move together up and down, so they do provide a hedge, and we quantify that and we manage that. But the point is that these are on an expected basis. And the portfolio, because of the shaping, can also introduce risks that can drive costs up or down. Next slide, please. This is, so the previous slide, we talked about the energy position. In addition to the energy position, we have our clean target goals, where we want to serve with 100% clean energy. And it's showing that we're about 62% for the next fiscal year. And we have about 38% that we gotta still contract for. And on the right side is our resource adequacy position. We still have some months in a challenging capacity constrained market to fill our resource adequacy obligations. All of these were factored into the 259 million costs. I'm just showing you the positions. Next slide, please. So coming back to the control and oversight that we have in the power procurement portfolio. Again, the risk management policy lays out our hedging strategy, which is something we can do to manage a volatile portfolio cost, is to hedge. And it lays out who can do what. It lays out the CEO can execute for transactions up to 5 years with suppliers that meet our credit terms under the EEI master agreement contracts. Same for clean procurement, same for reliability. And then every month, the risk oversight committee basically reviews our portfolio and the procurement plan and the procurement decisions as to how we're managing the portfolio. And then there's the long-term PPAs. Of course, every long-term PPA comes for explicit approval of the entire board. Next slide, please. So a little bit about, we talked about this how can we manage, what levers do we have to manage our costs? And these are policy level decisions, but again, they can reduce costs, but it lowers our value proposition, right? How do we distinguish ourselves from PG&E, how we serve the goals and missions of the organization? Of course, one of them is by providing 100% clean energy, but the requirement, if we wanted to, we could just say we want to meet at the minimum RPS level. If we were to do so for the upcoming fiscal year, we would save about 800,000. The reason that's not a higher number is because we've already contracted quite a bit of renewable contracts. And in the future years, we're not showing a savings because our PPAs that are coming online will give us already rec positions that are higher than the state minimum mandates. And we're not showing what we could gain by selling them. And same with carbon free, we could say we don't have to meet the remainder of our portfolio with carbon free resources. For the current upcoming fiscal year, we would save about 2 million. This is assuming we get the PG&E allocations. We have the PG&E allocations, and they are in the magnitudes that we've assumed in our modeling. And in the future years, on a cumulative basis, from 23 to 25, we've got somewhere around 7.5 million. And again, as prices fluctuate, these values obviously would change as well. And the next line I show, if we didn't get the PG&E allocations, obviously the savings would be higher. The other lever we can increase, decrease is what we use to fund our programs. Currently our target, we transfer close to $5 million out of our operating budget to programs budget. So we could save $5 million a year if we were to cut that expense. The other is the discount we provide to our customer. The 1% discount roughly translates to about $4 million a year. And then the other action that we're doing to reduce our costs is the power prepay transaction. And we're expecting savings to be around 1.5 million here. And a lot of that will depend on, what the spreads are between the taxable and tax-exempt interest rates. And I'll just tell you that the market is looking very favorable. And that's why we're actually speeding up our effort on that project, because the market is kind of ripe for execution in the summer. Next slide, please. So Grish mentioned some of the new or additional cost pressures we're facing in the upcoming fiscal year, which will be reflected in the budget. We have the new costs associated with integrating our PPAs that are coming online, the scheduling, the technical consulting, and the legal support we need. Staffing, we talked a lot about that, the new positions that we will be adding, comprehensive salary review, and monetary as well as non-monetary retention incentives. The other item I want to emphasize, and we have some slides in the appendix in slides 21 and 22 in particular, is our business process optimization. That's what I mean by BPO. As we're maturing, our systems and processes need to mature, and not having systems and processes also adds to staffing issues, because it creates a lot of manual, labor-intensive, and error-prone work, which adds to staffing frustrations. So building a robust platform that's in line with a portfolio of our size, given industry practices, is what we're targeting to do with our BPO process. We already have efforts underway. We have a contractor working with us on this project, and there are a number of tools and resources we need to build, buy, and integrate to basically streamline our work processes, make our work processes less error-prone, make sure they're auditable, and we have data to make insightful decisions about our portfolio and how we manage the business. The other area we've talked a lot about is the cybersecurity improvements. We've hired a company right now. We're going through a security assessment, and they will give us a gap analysis and architectural review, and out of that will come work products that will also entail some costs. And the last one we've talked a lot about is the uncertainty about our customer-related uncollectible expense. There's a good chance that this may not be much of an issue for us. Some projections I'm showing in the appendix, but with the governor's allocation of $1 billion, this may not be that sizable or for us, but nevertheless, it is introducing uncertainty that we do have to account for and manage. Andrea, next slide, please. So now I want to come to a policy level questions that we need guidance on. So I talked about power supply costs, that they're volatile, and I cannot give you a power supply. And we talked about this in the February executive committee meeting. You know, when we set the budget, let's say for current fiscal year, we're saying 235 million. What does that mean? Come September, if we have a heat going into August, we can say, yeah, looks like right now, in fact, the data I have shows we're on track with that budget. But come September, let's say there's a heat wave. And during that month, the CAISO sends us a bill that ends up exceeding, and we end up exceeding 235 million. There's no opportunity for us to come to the board and say, give us authority. And also, we just want to think through, what does it mean when the board sets a budget, right? What is the explicitly approving? We talk to other CCAs, they don't take the interpretation that the power supply expenses, they have to stay within that number. When MCE, for example, said their board actually does not explicitly approve a power supply expense, they approve other non-operating expenses. So staffing, you know, let's say we're asking 6.3 million for staffing, whatever that is. If, you know, we can manage that, that's not subject to market. And the other thing is when we set our budget and when we come to the board and we say, let's say next year's projected, I'm making this number up, is 40 million contribution to reserve. We can't really manage that because that depends on two volatile factors. One is revenues. If customer loads deviate, the contribution to margin can change. If customer loads deviate, if power prices fluctuate, power supply expenses can deviate. And the reality is we have to use reserves to balance that, because at the end of the day, CAISO is going to send us a bill. They're going to look and say, here's your load, here's your obligations that were used to meet your load, here's a bill. And at that point, we have to use the reserves. So just want to be more explicit that when we come to the board in September and ask for a budget approval, we're saying explicitly approve operating expenses other than power supply expenses to be, let's say, 20 million or 25 million. And if we were to exceed that because we wanted to spend more on advertising, on programs as a separate budget, by the way, we would come to the board and ask for explicit approval. But if there are fluctuations due to revenues, because our loads are different, you know, we have a faster recovery or a slower recovery from COVID, or power supply expenses are realized, actual power supply expenses are different than what we forecasted, that those variations, and only those variations, can be used to meet, we can use reserves to use that, those variations. I put the reserve policy in the slide here. The current reserve policy says to use the reserves, we can only do so at the direction of board of directors. But the reality is when those costs fluctuate, that's what we keep reserves for, and that we will vary those fluctuations with reserves. So we just want to clean up our policy to be in line with what is practical and actually what's happening in place. So just want to bring this up for discussion that depending on the guidance you give us, we will update the policy and bring it for board approval. Next slide, please. So Girish already talked about that. To manage the organization as we're maturing, we want some flexibility to to manage the staffing of the organization. The current practice is that any changes to staffing, job description, headcount changes, salary range adjustments, organizational chart changes, even if we're moving headcount from one department to another, we bring it all to the board for approval. But we're asking for flexibility is that the board sets at the budget time or with explicit approval of the board will set a headcount number and a budget number. But they give the CEO flexibility within that budget and headcount number to make changes as appropriate to manage the organization. So if we're capacity constrained in one area, give the CEO their authority to take a resource from one area to another area, make promotions, changes as needed within, again, the board approved headcount and budget. And any changes the CEO makes would be communicated by the CEO at the next board meeting. Okay, next slide. So now we come to reserves. The good news is we will be starting next year with healthy reserves. This is based on our mid-year budget forecast so far. We're showing 2020 end of the current fiscal year, we would have about 226 days of cash on hand. As of end of April, we have 240 days of cash in reserve. So one of the things that's up for renewal is our line of credit we have with our bank. So currently we have about 35 million line of credit. For the most part, that line of credit is untapped, with the exception of a couple of millions of letters of credit that it supports. And when we were starting out, we needed that level of liquidity. But now, given our reserve position, we're saying it doesn't really make sense to pay at a cost of close to $150,000 a year to keep that reserve, that line of credit for 35 million that we don't tap into. But what we're saying is that another way to say is that the 35 million was providing about 50 days of liquidity or 50 days of cash on hand. And in higher cost years, it could have been down as low as 30 days. So what we're saying is, let's save that 150,000 a year. But given the upcoming year is going to be a year where we can actually be in a position to improve our reserve positions, we can change our target. That 50 days it was providing, let's add that to our targets. So the minimum goes from 90 to 140, the target goes from 180 to 230, and the maximum goes to 270 to 320 days. And reserves is one of the key distinctions that separates us from others, right? So when we met yesterday with S&P, they were asking us, how are you different than WCE that went through bankruptcy? The first thing we talk about is our reserves. And that's the most defensible line that we can use. So we want to make sure we always have a healthy set of reserves, and it will position us well, not only to manage the uncertainty we're facing, but in this era of extra judgment and scrutiny on CCAs, that also will help us. So this is our recommendation on the reserve policy, and our recommendation is not to renew the line of credit because we don't really need to tap into it. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is just listing, you're familiar with this. There are a lot of uncertainty in our business that rains down on us. And the protection we have against these uncertainties is maintaining a healthy reserve balance. So very quickly, the cybersecurity risk we face, supply, the market price uncertainty, PCIA, PG&E rate, load uncertainty, payments, customer defaults, collateral postings. This can have a big impact on our cash management because this is where, when our contracts are in the money, we ask them to give us post money as means of mitigating our credit risk. Same thing can happen when the contract's in the money in the favor for the counterparty. They can ask us to post collateral, and that can be a big draw on our cash. So we have to manage these positions. We have to have sufficient reserves to be able to manage that kind of draw on liquidity. We have the regulatory uncertainty, and another area we're focusing attention on is overall electric rate affordability. We have to keep that in perspective of our customers in mind, because as overall, not just the generation rate, but the T&D portion also goes up. It has implications for electrification type goals and customer affordability. So something we have to also keep in mind. Next slide. Okay, so this brings me to the summary. Again, next year, thankfully, is looking good based on numbers we're seeing right now. The key risk, again, is the PCIA, PG&E rates and the significant run-up in prices. We're recommending that we keep the discount at 1% and revisit it once the rates are known. We're asking the board that when we set the budget, we set it for other operating expenses that are within the control of the organization, and then for not explicitly approve power supply to stay within a fixed number, because that's not practical. And then we have other controls in place to manage power supply expenses, the ERM policy, the risk committee oversight, and the controls within the ERM policy. And that we be able to use reserves to manage fluctuations due to power supply expenses and revenues. And then we also are asking for CE staffing flexibility. I forgot to put that in the summary slide. And then the last one is that we let our line of credit expire, but in lieu of that, we increase our reserves target. And I think there's one more slide, just reminding you of the timeline. We'll based on the recommendations you make today, we will reflect that in our budget numbers to the Finance Committee in August 2nd, and then we'll bring it to the board, a draft of it on August 11th for approval on September 8th. I think that's all I had, and there's some other slides in the appendix for information.
Okay, that was a lot and very well done. Thank you, Amrit. Lot there. Thank you. Okay, so we'll do director's questions and Director Flygore.
Thanks, Chair, and I'll pick up on exactly what you said. This was a lot. And so if this is going to be on our August 11th board meeting, I strongly recommend that we have a light agenda, because there's so many questions and discussion, I think, that should come out of this presentation. It's an excellent presentation. I won't ask all the questions that I would love to ask. I'm actually just going to narrow in on the proposal about the power supply contracts and not including that in the budget, because I think that's where a lot of the discussion may focus at the August 11th meeting, but there's a lot more in this presentation. And so my immediate reaction was, not being comfortable with this idea of giving this delegation that with the fluctuation, if it goes above, is it 235 million, you tap into the reserves. And I understand why, but just from a control oversight perspective, I'm thinking there should be a cap on that. There should be some approval mechanism. or some notification, maybe even at the executive committee level. But I understand why that recommendation is being made, but I'm not 100% comfortable with not having some oversight of what that could mean to our reserve and tapping into our reserves, especially when the next slide after that talked about, the benefits to the organization from having a strong reserve. It's so important for us as a CCA to have those strong reserves. So I have so many, but I will stop there. But that policy, I think, deserves a lot of discussion, and how we address the issue you've raised, but still allow the board to have some say in what happens there. And then the last thing I'll ask, and that I know it's the question portion, and then the last thing I would ask, I think maybe you could also include, and maybe I missed that slide in it, is, are there other areas where we can cut, as opposed to trying to figure out, if there is a difference, if there's a fluctuation, should we, look to the budget to see if there are other areas we can cut and make adjustments to offset that fluctuation, as opposed to automatically going to the reserves to make up that difference.
Thank you, Director Tyson, and then Director Abikoga.
Well, that was a lot of things. And so as I understand it, what we're doing here today is you're trying out this presentation on us, and you're getting an idea on response for the presentation and how it's structured, and then also just any specific points to be alert to that might be of special interest. And so
Right.
That's good. So I'm inclined to agree with what I heard from Director Flieger in terms of that aspect of control. That I think that's going to be some discussion. In short, some of the other things that I heard were things like the staffing change in terms of the controls. I'm okay with that. The expiration of the letter of credit, I can see that. This is also based on the fact that we think our finances are going to be strong and we're going to position to build up our reserves. I think we should point to that as being, that's the way that we're going to keep the good credit rating and allow us flexibility for other things. During the whole presentation, I was thinking, well, what is the load and how is that going to change? And you had a little bit of that in a late slide. It's kind of, you had this sort of big rainbow of uncertainty, which is of about 8 different points, and that was one. And so I'm still puzzling over how much our load is going to change through recovery from COVID, and of course, and then also what are some of the structural things that we're encouraging that might affect load. So such as electric homes and more EVs and that sort of thing. And then finally, Amrit, I'm just going to say, try to punch up the presentation some, okay? I realize, so make clear transitions and make it more dramatic. Be a little bit more like Director Flieger, I would say. And just because you've got a bunch of things, and you don't want to talk faster and therefore try to go over our head. So I would just say, make sure you build in transitions and make it easy for us to see, maybe to say, I've got 6 suggestions here, and now here's the first one, kind of a way to help us kind of see where we are in the presentation.
Thank you, Director Tyson, and Director Abikoga.
Thank you. So I have similar thoughts to both the directors who spoke before me. It is a lot, and I was just trying to think, what do we have in August? I think we're going to have a closed session, I believe, too. So yeah, so we'll have to figure out what our agenda and try to figure out ways to lighten it up as much as possible, because this is quite a bit. And yeah, I'm trying to kind of look at the presentation again and see if there's ways to maybe even streamline it. But I think the key issue is the issue about the budget and not including resource the resource costs, and I guess I was trying to think about what we could do. I do believe that we do, as a board, we should be seeing the entire budget. I understand the fluctuations. So I was thinking, like, I can't remember what we do now. Like, do we do a mid-year check-in and an adjustment at mid-year? And is that just not enough? Do we have, is it more frequent that these fluctuations occur? Yeah, I guess if you can maybe enlighten me on the timing of some of this, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so a few things there. So our intention was not to include it. We would show the budget as we're showing it today, but we just want explicit acknowledgement as to what it means when we deviate from that. And the problem tends to happen in the last month.
Okay.
So because let's say September, going into September, we are on target to be at 235 million. But then all of a sudden demand spikes or prices goes up. We end up actually at 250 or 240, let's say.
Okay.
There's nothing we can do at that point. We can't hedge anymore. We are subject to the whims of the market. CAISO will settle based on where the numbers are and will send us a bill. And then when we look at it, like, oh, we dipped into reserves. So the point was that we would still bring the budget and show you what our net position is on an expected basis, that we, as we do today, but acknowledge, because we would technically be in violation that, hey, why did you dip into reserves without board explicit approval? But the reality is there's not much we could have done at that month.
Okay. So you would still show it to us, but it would probably be.
Yeah. And one other thing we're working on, we're a little staff strained right now, but hoping to do it by end of the year, is in the treasurer report that we show every month. Right now we show where we are, but we also want to, going forward, show how we expect the year to settle out based on the updated market price information that we have.
Right.
We won't recast the whole budget. We don't need to, like programs and all those things. But the key variability being our load and our power prices. As those fluctuate, we'll give you a forecast. You know, we were expecting to end the year 40 million in positive. Now we're going to be 45 million. We're going to be 35 million. And next month we'll give you next month's projection. So that's another layer of information that you'll have to know how the year is going to shape. That will be more informative.
Okay. So then how does page let's see, it's the one about you know, the levers. Where does this come in then? Slide 10. I know we've been talking about it, and I think looks like we are in a better position now than we thought we were. So maybe we don't have to talk about it yet. But that's, yeah, I guess the question is, when are these some of the issues we should be tackling now to try to limit the liability that we see coming down the road?
So the point we wanted to show with the financial levers is these are, just as the name implies, you know, some things within the board's control. You can change that and change our cost profile. You know, you can say, I just want to meet the RPS, but again, it takes away from our value proposition and who we are. We want to cut the programs. Again, it takes away from what we want to do. And the good thing is, you know, Nextel is looking good, so we don't have to make those, but it's just a reminder that this is in your toolbox and to use if you need to manage the costs. And we we provide 1% discount to customers. Some CCAs provide rates higher than PG.
So is this something we would discuss if we saw successive years of decline?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to work on a bunch of different things and come back to them. So one of the things I would offer is a good example of why the contingency, the reserve rather, the reserve was never intended to be a reserve for the organization, i.e. staff and consultant expenses. It was always intended to be a reserve for the market flexibility, fluctuation of price. Either something went way up and our hedge wasn't enough, or our demand went off. So I think it's important to understand that the reserve is not quite the same as a reserve for a normal business, because we have a commodity that we cannot directly control. We can plan for, but we can't directly control. So the example I have in my mind is thinking about, has everybody done a house remodel project, a kitchen, a bathroom, a landscape? And you get it all planned out. And then they hit a water main, or your neighbor trips over something on the sidewalk. These are the unknown things that you can never plan for. So when you do your budgeting for any kind of remodel project, you always have a contingency, and it's the owner's contingency. So when we're talking about putting policies together for this, I would think we want to come up with a good definition of what the reserve is really there for. And the policy would be that the CEO has the flexibility to inform the board, but react in an appropriate, timely manner of 5 or 10%. So if our estimate is 250 million, then 10% would be a $25 million contingency. So it's whatever happens, you make it 5%, whatever number you want to pick, that they have, staff and the CEO have the ability to do what it takes to manage the commodity of power to adjust to the unknown. They cannot go over that contingency amount without coming to the board. And after a period of a year or two with this, you can sort of say, 5% is enough, or 10%, whatever. So I think that gives assurance to the board of what we're talking about and the control. So think of it as a contingency amount, which can be set, and it can be acted on by policies that we're putting in place, starting with the premise of what the reserve is really there for and how it should be utilized. So that's kind of my thought on that. I would say that the comment made earlier about beginning the presentation with there are going to be 5 points here. I'm point 1, I'm point 2, point 3 will be very, very helpful. I'm almost thinking that there might be a good break point when you come back to ask for questions. These are the things that we're coming back to you on. I'm not sure right now how to say this, but I do think there should be a break. Okay, and say, here we've covered points 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, and maybe even say, I'm not sure if you want to ask questions then or not, but has everybody followed that discussion? Because now we're going to begin a discussion on the ask. Okay, I'm just thinking out loud with you. And in terms of your presentation, Amrit, just be careful when you're speaking, your voice drops at the end. And it's hard, I really was straining. I sort of knew what you were saying, but it was a little tough. So I think breaking the presentation with, clear points, I think Director Tyson said was very good. Yeah, let's see, on slide number 7, the hedge is not by, I thought that was an extremely important point, but I'm not sure how much detail we need to go into for the budget in August. The hedge is not by hour, it's long and short term. It's a very good point. And in the graph, you had the yellow and the green, and then you were trying to explain the 24% that was missing. I think if you put a box around it and hatched it to show that it was going to the line above, graphically, it would read a little more clearly. That's what we're talking about that we have to figure out, or whatever your point was. I just thought leaving the gap with the line floating above was a little hard to follow. Slide number 8. Does that include the new RA increased requirement?
Not slide 8. I think slide.
Yeah, slide 8. That's the one I'm
slide
looking at.
9 shows the
Okay.
resource adequacy.
Okay. Now on my slides, it's 8. The graphic is on 8.
Oh, 8. Yeah, it is. I'm sorry. I have a different version, I guess.
All right. So you have a dashed line, and that's the void, right? That's the short.
Yeah.
Does that include the new RA requirement that Melissa mentioned?
I'm not sure. I'd have to ask Monica, but I believe it.
Okay, just a question. Just make sure that there's a connection. Even if you went so far as to do a different dash line and say, this is where our RA was, and this is where it now needs to be. I think that would be, again, just helping the board understand and show how much everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
I thought slide 10, levers to manage margin. Where's slide 10 if we could? Let's see. Yeah, I thought this was a very good slide because it ties in 2 things. One, it just ties in with the, and you can say this slide relates to our discussion on reserves. I think that was a good correlation as to why you're bringing it up here. And let me see, what am I trying to say here? I'll give you another comment that sort of segues back to this. When we've had these presentations in the past, and I've seen a few of them, we have been very, very cautious, and we've almost always, as I recall, given a range of what PG&E's rate is going to be and what the PCIA is going to be. We've never honed in, I don't recall anyway, a specific number and a specific number. So that makes me a little nervous because we know we have had a situation, I'm going to say 2 years ago, where our best guess at PG&E was off the mark. So I do think I appreciate the reference to our other sources and everything, but we have to know that PG&E is volatile. So, and we don't know what this summer is going to bring and impact PG&E. So I would say that it might help. I'm thinking of some risk management diagrams. You know how you have the high mountain bar and the low bar? This is the range. We've had consensus at this point, and we're budgeting on this. But as we get closer to the September board meeting, we can have more confidence in this number. I think something like that would be helpful. And again, it has a lot to do with having seen a lot of these before. And I always got comfort on the fact that we had a range as opposed, because we just don't know what PG&E is going to come up with. The other thing I was trying to figure out how to fit in your discussion. Yeah, I put reserves are not operational. So when we do the budget for operations, this is our staff and all the other things you showed on the pie chart. That should also have a contingency. I think that it's going to be based on what the new staffing need is and all of that, which you've got a pretty good handle on. But again, there are times when we don't know. So there should be a little contingency put in there as well. I'm fine with eliminating the line of credit for the reasons you've cited. Let's see. And then I put another note in here. I do think it might be helpful at some point. I don't quite know where, but the reserve discussion, people still ask us, I got a weird question today. People still ask us, what's going to happen? Are we going to have a Texas scenario? They know it's not winter, but are they going to have a scenario more with, actually, it's more with the brownouts? It's clear we're not going to be planning for PSs, but what are we planning for brownouts? How is that impacting our cost? What is the risk of cost to our customers? So I think if you look at the reserve as a cushion, and the contingency is the cushion to address the unknown, something like that might help. Okay. And the comment on the business process optimization and a maturing organization, we've been building on that discussion for several months now, so I think that makes sense. And again, best practices from other agencies will be helpful. So however we want to bring that into the discussion. I would agree, I think, and Director Flygar and Abikoga have their hands up again. I think the main comments you've heard reaction from us is around the discussion of how to build up the reserves and how to use the reserves and how to separate the reserves from operating expenses versus commodity. I'm going to use the word commodity expenses is really out of the presentation because one, it was the last thing that focused us, but also it's the most impactful, I think, in many, many ways. The others have been building over time. Okay, my thoughts. And then we'll go back to Director Flygore and then Abikoga.
Thanks, Chair, and I'll be quick. I know it's late. I just wanted to encourage Amrit to include in his presentation your point, which I thought was a very good point, the intention behind the reserves. I was viewing it as an organizational reserve, but as you said, you know, there are different ways to structure the reserves and maybe we could have separate types of reserves. I know for Los Altos, we have like a technology reserve, we have different pots of reserve funds separate from that 20% organizational reserve. So that's one approach we could consider, having separate reserves, or as you called it, contingency funds. And then, and the other thing I'd mentioned, which I echo what you said, was the idea of maybe giving some delegation up to a certain amount or up to a certain percent, where they wouldn't have to come back to us if it fluctuated within that range.
Thank you. Girish, do you want to speak now or do you want to wait for Abikoga? Okay, Director Abikoga. You're muted, yeah.
Saw that, thank you. So I really agree with Chair Gibbons. I really appreciate your suggestion, and that kind of triggered what I was thinking and I forgot about. But I think all municipalities, we do have different kinds of reserves, and you know, in Mountain View we have our reserve at 20 to 25% that really is not to be touched, and then we have the rainy day fund, which is our economic contingency fund. So that was when we had the recession and so forth, and that's what we would dip into if we needed to make that up that difference. So I kind of liken it to what Chair Gibbons was describing, and maybe we can look at doing it in that way. And the rainy day fund would be the one that could be you could go to you know, make up any differences you need to, and then we could replenish it each year if we need to. And then I think that would help us also see or track how it's going. And if we see a trend that we keep having to replenish it, then that might trigger the discussion on the other financial levers, is how I was looking at it. So that was my thought. And then the other question I guess I have, or maybe I just forgot, but I know we have the minimum, mid, and high ranges in our reserves. And I guess I'm starting to question if we need that, or maybe you can explain why we need that, if we're going to move towards maybe actually just creating different pots of reserves. Do we really need to have those 3 levels anymore?
That's a great question, a comment. And CEO Balachandra, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Chair Gibbons. So I'm going to try and maybe summarize what you've said in terms of direction, because that's the other thing. Some very good comments on format, etc. And I really don't think we're going to go into this level of detail with the board. I think that's kind of what the executive committee is for. We'll go into this level of detail with the comments you provided at the August 2nd Finance Committee. But for the board, I think we'll keep it quite high level and policy level. So here are some takeaways. I think we'll create like a $20 million rainy fund, which essentially we can tap into without coming back to you, right? So, and then we'll track that. And if we, again, this is insurance, right? And if we start to see if we use it or we have other forecasts about increased costs, that's when we will be engaging in the financial levers. So just to be clear, the reason we're bringing up financial levers is we're managing upwards because we have very ambitious goals. And if things move sideways on the power supply side in terms of pricing, some of those goals may have to be diluted. And that's what those financial levers are. We don't need to deal with that in the coming year. So, but this is more for the board as a whole. So I think we'll create a rainy fund, 20-ish million bucks. That's number one. Are you okay with that? If you're okay with that, that gives us a general direction.
If I may clarify, that is for procurement of power related to.
Yeah. It's for power. Not for my buying bonus or anything like that. No. That's a different discussion.
My bonus.
Yeah. Another one, though we didn't explicitly give you a number, one thing we want to confirm, which is part of the strategic plan, etc., our operating costs are going to go up with additional staffing. You need to know that. Shouldn't be a shock to you. Today, we spend our operating costs at about $17 million. That about $6 million or so is staffing, about $3 million for data management, about $2 million for PG&E. There's a whole set of costs, which works out to about $17 million. It's going to go up by 15% or so. It'll be about 2 million, 2.5 or so. We'll get the right numbers in. But that's another one that's reflective of the strategic plan direction to making sure that we are staffed up appropriately into that next level of our evolution. So that's number 2. And getting some head nods there. Third is eliminating the line of credit and increasing the reserves 50 days. Fourth is the discount that we're going to incorporate into the budget is 1%. But we do have a caveat on that, which is when we see the updated PG&E numbers in November, we'll come back to you. So if the numbers turn out to be as good for us as we're seeing now, we'll probably come in and ask you to increase the discount. Last, it's the opposite. It is a financial lever, but it's not when we are in bad times. If we are in good times, which we think we are going to go, we will get some money to the margin. Do you want to increase funding on programs? So from a mission-based standpoint, do you want to increase that? That's also a direction that will be useful for us to put into our budget. And that's the only one that we've not talked about today.
No, we have not talked about a lot.
Everything else I'm getting head nods on. So.
Yeah, we talked about it in the previous discussion. I think there was a lot of favorable conversation about programs and the equity issue, and also city being tighter connected to our cities. I'm seeing a yes on all of that.
Good, then we'll come back with some options. I think these 5 areas provided us direction. And
sorry, Director Elahi, are you okay with all of this?
Yeah, it's fine.
Thank you. Sorry. Girish, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Yeah, so very useful feedback. Just to summarize, we'll create a rainy fund at about $20-ish million. Eliminate the LOC, increase reserves by 50 days. Discount is 1%. Increase in operating costs about 15-ish% or so, from 17 million. It'll start to approach close to 20, about 19-20 million. And last is we'll provide you some options on increasing program expenditure that'll focus on transportation, building decarbonization, virtual power plants, and more connections with cities.
Okay, so don't cut your operational budget too tight, because knowing what we've gone through the last years, it's needed to be flexible for you. And are you going to change your role? Do we need to make any changes in policy?
Yeah, I think we've got. Sorry, I think I should have said that too. I will bring back. So yes, so let's add that. I will bring back a proposal for a change in policy that will allow me more flexibility in changing titles. So essentially, the board will approve the labor budget and give me certain constraints about what I can do, but I'll have the ability to, change titles and move positions, etc. So we will get that. I'll add that as number 6.
Okay, so that looks affirmative as also.
Say that again. Sorry.
That's affirmative for the group as also, yes. There's Director Elahi as well. All right, we have gone over our allotted time by 15 minutes. So how are we doing? Have we need anything else? Do you need anything else from us? No? Okay.
Good.
Thank you. That was very well done. And we look forward to, or whoever does, look forward to the Finance Committee presentation, and then to the full board. Well done all, and we will see you mañana.